Well, we are continuing our study on the Sermon on the Mount, and we're going to begin with Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 today. Now, I said in the first message on this series that many post-Christian Americans reject the gospel. They do not believe in the divinity, atoning work of Jesus Christ and his redemption, but they still really like the Sermon on the Mount because the Sermon on the Mount represents Jesus' high moral and ethical teaching. And generally this is true. Many people see Jesus as being a wise and great moral teacher, but I don't think this applies to today's topic. Jesus' words in today's passage are on the untouchable topic of sexual ethics. And so most in our culture, just if they really love the Sermon on the Mount, they probably haven't read these words too deeply, because I believe that Jesus' words today are highly offensive to our current culture. And by offensive, I mean that we generally think that we are right. And when Jesus tells us how wrong our actions and views are, we think he's wrong. We take offense at his words. Well, the Christian approach to Jesus' words is to recognize that he is right, that he is calling us to a higher standard, and that our lives do not measure up. This is not the language of offense. It is the language of conviction, that Christ is right and it is my life that is wrong. Well, as we open up this passage, let me give you just a little bit of context. A couple of weeks ago, we said that Jesus begins this section by saying he did not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. And he tells us that our righteousness must be greater than the scribes and the Pharisees. So Jesus is looking at individual laws, but he's taking us deeper. He's calling us to a higher standard than even the religious people of his day. And so last week, we started with the first of these six statements. Jesus says, "You've heard that it said, but I say." And last week it was on murder. And Jesus takes us to a higher standard. He takes us deeper. Today we're looking at the second and third statement, both dealing with the sin of adultery. So three things today. We're going to talk about three ways we justify sexual sin in our culture. Secondly, we're going to talk about how we are called to protect the sacred. And lastly, we're going to talk about two ways forward. Also, just a heads up, if you are watching this video with children, we are definitely going to be talking about things that are sexual. Now, nothing graphic or explicit. I'm actually okay if my children watch this video because I really want to be upfront and open with them. So nothing graphic, but I do want you to be warned. This is a little bit more explicit than our typical sermons. So our main text today, Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 to 32. And then we're also going to be drawing quite a bit from Matthew chapter 19, verses 1 to 12. So you may want to pause this and read that passage as well. But now we're going to open up the text, the words of Jesus from Matthew chapter 5, starting at verse 27. "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body go into hell. It was also said, 'Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce.' But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." This is the word of our Lord, and tough words they are. Well, first, let's talk about three ways we justify our sexual sin as a culture. The first is to justify our sin internally. Jesus says, "You've heard it said, 'You shall not commit adultery.'" And we said this last week. Almost all of the population, very, very small percentage, have actually committed murder. So most of us look at the commandment on murder and we say, "Shoo, I'm good." And then a large percentage of our population could say, "I've never actually committed adultery." So we think we're clear on both of these commandments. I've never acted out committing adultery. But then Jesus says, "But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Well, a couple of notes here. Jesus specifically speaks to the masculine. He speaks to the male. He who commits adultery. He's speaking to men. And probably this is for a reason. I think the sin of lust and adultery is perhaps more committed by men than women. But I don't think this lets women off the hook. This can be applied to both sexes. The same goes for, in a few minutes when we talk about divorce, Jesus specifically used the masculine term, male. He says, he who divorces his wife. But this probably has far more to do with just the legal statutes of the time. Men had a lot more liberty to divorce their wives than vice versa. Wives could not divorce their husbands. But in today's culture, both sexes fall under Jesus' words. And then a second note, when we look at the Greek here, Jesus says everyone who looks at a woman to lust after her is really the way the Greek reads. The Greek word for lust is epithumeo, which means with passion or with heat. And so the motivation, whoever looks at a woman in order to feed this inner desire of lust has already committed adultery. This is different than seeing a person and appreciating their beauty. This is not the first look where you recognize that someone is attractive. This is the second look. It is the look with intent. It is the look that fantasizes sexually to fulfill one's inner heat, one's inner passion. So the word order is important here. We are looking in order to lust. And Jesus says, you may look at the act. You may not have actually committed adultery. But in all of these laws, Jesus pushes us towards the intent of the heart. He takes us deeper. And he says, this is very serious stuff. He doesn't let us off the hook because, yes, we may have some internal thoughts, but we've never actually acted on it, so we're off the hook. No, he takes us deeper. He says in verse 29, he says, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out. And then later on in the next verse, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. And he says, it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body be thrown into hell. Jesus is very serious. Now, I don't think he's being literal. The reason I don't think Jesus is being literal is because ripping out one's eye and cutting off one's hand does not make you immune to sin. A one-eyed or one-armed person can commit grave acts of evil. If you've ever watched the television show or the movie The Fugitive, you know this to be true, right? The bad guy is a one-armed guy. But Jesus is not speaking literally, he's speaking with hyperbole here, but it's pointing to the seriousness. He says, if you think that the problem is your body and just the physical act of adultery, you are wrong. And it is far better to lose your body than to have your heart and your soul destroyed in Gehenna. And so if you are internally justifying your sexual lust, I've never actually committed the act. I just lust and fantasize in my mind. I just am obsessed with pornography. Jesus says you are not innocent. And your sexual sin is already occurring in your heart and your mind. And really, you're probably just too much of a coward to follow through with it. But you will eventually. What's in your heart will come out. It will either come out and destroy your life externally, or it will eat you from the inside out. You cannot avoid your sexual sin by writing it off as just being an internal thing. So we justify our sexual sin by hiding it internally. Secondly, we justify our sexual sin legally. Those who say, if I can divorce my annoying, troublesome, obnoxious spouse legally, then I am clear to pursue whatever sexual relationship I want. I'll just get rid of this first spouse and pursue another one. I have found a legal loophole. I'll just divorce the one and then pursue whatever sexual devices that I want to after that. Well, Jesus says, you've heard that it said in verse 31, Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. So Jesus is quoting the Old Testament law. And what Jesus is quoting here is actually Moses' words from Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 to 4. I'd encourage you to read that as well. And in Moses' words, he says this: if a man takes a wife and he finds something indecent or shameful in her, then he can grant her a certificate of divorce. Now, there's an ambiguity in Moses' words. What does a shameful or indecent act really mean? Well, there's evidence that in Jesus' day, many people were applying this law very broadly. So a shameful act by one's wife could be pretty much whatever you wanted it to be. And it sounds like that a number of people were just broadly applying this, and so that they could really divorce their wife for whatever reason that they came up with. Also, this idea of granting a certificate of divorce, this was a public statement that the woman was legally divorced in the public eye and therefore could remarry. Now, if you think about ancient times, men were able to work and provide for themselves, but women were actually quite vulnerable culturally. And so a woman who was actually granted a certificate of divorce would be free to remarry, and most of the time they would, because they would need someone to provide for them and to protect them. And so it was actually in some ways a protection that the woman received this certificate. But then lastly, if you read the Mosaic Law, the original husband could not come back and bring his first wife back into marriage. Once he actually granted her a divorce and cast her away for whatever shameful reason that he came up with, he could not bring her back. And really what this does, it protects marriage and basically the trading of wives as a commodity. This was a protection. It was a law to protect against rampant and flippant divorce. It was a protection against the commodification of marriage. And in Jesus' day, some had so broadly applied this that this is what was happening. And so the question arises, and we see this again in Matthew chapter 19, the question is, what are the grounds for divorce? And Jesus takes Moses' words, but he narrows them. He says that with the exception of sexual immorality, and this is the same Greek word for fornication. This is basically the spouse has committed adultery already. With the exception of that, you are not allowed to divorce your spouse. And then he says strongly, in fact, when you do this, you are forcing her to commit adultery because she will most likely marry another man for protection. And then anyone who marries her will be committing adultery. And then if you go to Matthew chapter 19, and you are committing adultery if you do this. Jesus is closing this legal loophole. He says you are not free if you see divorce as a means to pursuing your sexual sin. You might be legally in the clear in the culture, but you are not morally in the clear. See, you cannot justify your sexual sin internally by keeping it all inside, nor can you justify your sexual sin legally by getting rid of one spouse and just bringing in another one. And so the third option, and this is not really from this text, but I do think it's broadly applied from Scripture and true for our time. The third way we try to justify our sexual sin is just to avoid marriage altogether. We want to have sex freely without the marital bonds. We have sexual liberty. Now, all throughout Scripture, we see this word fornication, which means having sex outside of the marital bond. And in Matthew 19, Jesus points us to the deeper sexual union. And he says this. He says, from the beginning, this is what you've heard. Therefore, man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. Jesus is pointing the sexual union with marriage all the way back to the beginning. And this is the principle that I think all throughout Scripture, this is where sex belongs. It is between one man and one woman in one union for one lifetime. One man, one woman, one union, one lifetime. And there are a lot of ways to justify our sexual sin, and Jesus' words are very hard, and they are particularly difficult for our culture. And I hear a lot of people say something like this. They say, you Christians are so negative and restrictive, especially when it comes to sex. You have so many prohibitions. You are repressive. You are legalistic. And now, just to be clear, one of my responses is, well, this is not just devout Christians. This is also devout Jews and devout Muslims and devout religious people of many shapes and forms all throughout the world that actually have very strict sexual ethics. So this could be broadly applied far beyond just Christians. But here's what I want us to point us to. This is not just prohibitions for no reason. So as a second point, I want to talk about protecting the sacred. See, we have prohibitions, and this is true. Jesus is being pretty prescriptive in the things that we cannot do. But there is a positive motivation behind his prohibitions. Think about the prohibition from last week. The prohibition against murder. Yes, it restricts us. We cannot murder other people. But there is a positive protection. The protection is what is sacred. It is protecting life. And that's pretty clear. Not too many people are trying to justify murder. And the prohibition against adultery and sexual sin is not just to be restrictive. It is to protect what is sacred. The protection of marriage, the protection of children, the protection of family, and ultimately the protection of society. See, since the sexual revolution, we have been told that sex is primarily about pleasure. It is about one's freedom. It is about one's self-expression and one's liberty. We must cast off all of the prohibitions that bind us and repress us sexually so that we can do what we want. And sexuality has been linked to individual rights. I can have sex with whomever I want. I can do whatever I want. It's about me, and the focus is on my freedom. But Jesus is pointing us to something that is far deeper, actually far more beautiful and profound when it comes to sexuality than what our culture is promoting. Let's look again at Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 19. He says, the two will become one flesh. This is how it's been since the beginning. This is the mysterious union of husband and wife. And the question is, our culture says sex is only about pleasure. And is it about pleasure? You better believe it. Yes. It is about pleasure, but it's about far more than just mere pleasure. It is about union, a spiritual, emotional, physical union of intimacy. It is about babies and children and protecting what is sacred. It is about stability for the next generation. It is not just about getting what I want. It is not about just using another person for my own selfish desire. It is about me giving myself to the one I am in covenant with. It is about giving myself to the other in love. See, we believe this lie in our culture that my behavior, my sin, won't affect anyone else. And we especially believe this when it comes to sex. I can do whatever I want. It's my body. It's my rights. I want my pleasure. I can do whatever I want with whomever I want, and it won't affect anyone else. And this is a flat out lie in our culture. Jesus gives us a deeper, more beautiful picture of sex in order to protect us, to protect our families, to protect this world, and to lead us into what is beautiful. For the past 2 generations, we have been blowing up families and individuals through our sexual exploits in our culture. Divorce has increased since the 1960s, about double the percentage are divorced now, and it's increasing. Here's something to think about. The earlier sex is introduced into a relationship, the more the more likely it is that the relationship will fragment. So we are rushing to have sex quicker and quicker, and yet more and more relationships are falling apart because they are not ready to be that intimate with each other, and it's destroying relationships. Children who grow up with both parents staying married have 200% to 300% better positive life outcomes than those whose parents separate. Sexual abuse, which is nearly impossible to get accurate statistics on because it is such a hidden evil in our culture, but it is clear that sexual abuse is on the rise. One study says that sexual abuse of children has increased 350% since 1980. As many as 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 7 boys will experience sexual abuse at some point during their childhood in America, the estimates are. These are hard statistics to figure out, but it's increasing. In 2005, and some of these are a little bit dated, but in 2005, the Department of Justice reported that there are an estimated 100 to 150,000 sex slaves in the United States since the early 2000s. Sex trafficking, which is a modern form of slavery, not based on plantations or skin color, but based on buying and selling human beings for sexual exploitation, is growing like never before in the United States. The U.S. Department of Justice reported that the age of 12, is the average age that a person enters the pornography industry, often leading to prostitution. Here's some newer statistics. Pornography is a $15 billion a year industry in the United States. 30% of all data exchanged on the internet is pornographic, according to the Huffington Post. The most searched pornographic subcategory last year was teen sex. And here's the lie. We tell ourselves, none of this horrific stuff that's happening in our culture has anything to do with my personal, individual behavior. See, I think I can be free. I can indulge in whatever I want. It won't affect anyone else. And at the same time, generations of families and children and lives are being exploited and destroyed because we want our sexual liberty. And here's what nobody else will tell you. The most sexually satisfied subcategory in America are long-term married couples. Which makes sense. Because Jesus is saying sex is this sacred and beautiful thing. It is about union. It is about intimacy. It is about spiritual, emotional, and physical bonding. And from the beginning, it's been one man and one woman in one union for one lifetime. And it is so sacred. And how could you bring in something that is so sacred when there is no commitment? How can you be so vulnerable when somebody is just using you for their own pleasure? See, satisfaction in sex comes with the covenant, the union of marriage. And any way we try to justify our sexual exploits outside of that union, we end up destroying our lives and the lives of others. I mean, I know this is an incredibly heavy and difficult message, but there is such a darkness in our culture. And there are so many caught up in this darkness, and it is destroying lives and families every day. And there's no sugarcoating any of this. And Jesus didn't sugarcoat it. Well, lastly, let me speak about a way forward. Because this is a hard message, and my goal today, believe me, it is not to heap guilt and shame upon you. I mean, who among us does not feel some sense of guilt about sexual sin? Who among us can cast the first stone? And guilt having to do with things that we've done is one thing, but shame, this brings shame because it seems to be so intimately connected to who we are. And so as I speak about these things, there's a deep shame for so many who have indulged or become addicted to pornography. And it's so hidden. It's internally hidden. There's a deep shame for so many who have been marred, hoping for the best in their marriage and ended up broken and divorced. Many divorced with no-fault divorce, with little say in the matter, just left, cast aside. There's a deep shame in so many children, victims of divorce, victims of abuse. It is unbelievable, the things that I hear, it seems like every week, from people who are so broken and shattered by these things. So my goal today is not to heap more shame upon you. We cannot change the past. We have to trust in God in the present. But I also want to say we can't do what Bonhoeffer says, which is just cheapen grace. We can't just say like, well, just don't worry about it. Keep indulging, keep going down this path. It'll be fine. No. The way forward, the first way forward is this. We have to face our sexual brokenness. We have to face our actual sin and addictions and abuse. Because what sin does is it isolates us, and then sin begins to internally work in us, and if we don't face it, it'll destroy us. You cannot change the past, but you can face your current circumstances and be honest about your own brokenness, even about your own sin. Most of us have experienced some degree of sexual brokenness, sexual sin, and we have to face it. And then secondly, in our honesty, as we face our sin, we seek God's mercy. We begin by confessing the reality that is our hearts. And then we meet a God of mercy and a God of transformation. Timothy Keller says this: the gospel shows us a God who is far more holy than the legalist can bear, and yet more merciful than the humanist can conceive. We admit our sin and our shame. And then we find a merciful God. As we confess, He is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Well, let me conclude by telling a story about my own idiocy. When we lived in Michigan, this is a number of years ago, but I had a friend, his name was Brian. Brian, if you're watching, hello. But we used to work out together, and he lived out in the country, and there was a bunch of country roads to get to him. And it was in March, and every a couple times a week, I'd go over to his place, we'd work out. It was good. It was a good friendship. And we had a big snowstorm in March and gotten quite a bit of snow. I think we had over a foot. And so a couple of days had come and gone since then. And I called up Brian. I said, hey, we're going to work out today. And he said, it's still pretty bad out there. And I'm like, how bad can it be? Because it had been a couple of days. Well, it was all back roads and dirt roads to get to Brian's house. And so I was going down this dirt road. I was 2.5 miles from his house. And the dirt road had been plowed, and there was, 2 lanes of traffic. But the farther I got on this road, the more the plowed area narrowed. And I went about a mile down the road, and by the time I got to a mile, I had crossed over another intersection, and it was down to just like 1 lane plowed. And so I just keep going, and I'm driving by the way, I was driving at my time this little like Saturn sedan, which is this like small little front wheel drive car, but I'm going forward, and the farther I get forward, the more I'm thinking like, I sure hope this continues because I can't continue on this road. And then eventually it narrowed and narrowed, and then it stopped. Like everything had drifted and there was no path forward. And I was only like a mile from Brian's house. And I had 2 decisions. My first decision was I can stop and I can back up for about 2 miles. I can just throw it in reverse and back up and get out of here and go home. Or I can gun it and try to get through. And I, being the young, foolish man that I was, hit the gas and I gunned it. And I hit that snow so hard, and I went in about 40, 50 yards and just buried my car out in the middle of nowhere, up, over a foot of snow, just totally sunk. And I sat there and I thought, what do I do? And I tried to back up, and it just dug in deeper, and I was just totally stuck. There was no getting myself out. And I just thought, Who do I call? And my most profound thought of the day is, I am such an idiot. How did I end up so stuck? Maybe that's where you are today. Sexual sin will take us far, far deeper than we ever imagined it would. And one day we often wake up and it's just like, how did I get here? How am I so stuck? And the shame and the weight, it just feels like there's no way out. And the reality is there is no way out on your own. I sat there in my car just like, God, I am such an idiot. What do I do? And I didn't know who to call. And after about 10 minutes of me just sitting in my misery, recognizing how stupid I was, there was a farmer showed up and he was on his tractor. And this guy he pulled up and I just felt like such an idiot. And he pulled out a chain. He's like, what were you doing there, son? And I'm like, I'm a fool. Like, I don't know what I was thinking. And I said, can I pay you something? Like, let me do something. He's like, no, I'll pull you out. And he pulled me out like 50 yards through snow. It was so embarrassing. But he rescued me. And I tried to pay him. I tried to give him something. And he's just like, nah, just go home. Be with your family. And I was like, thank you. And it just was such an image of how we live our lives. Going our own way in our foolishness. And we can't get out. We begin by facing the reality of our situation. We are stuck and we cannot fix our lives. And then we cry out to mercy. And in his mercy, God meets us. There's nothing that you have done that there cannot be found mercy and forgiveness and grace. You may feel such a deep shame. You may feel so incredibly stuck. But there is a God of mercy who will meet you there. It begins by facing the reality of your situation and then meeting a God who rescues us in our brokenness. May you know the mercy of God as you take an honest look of your own life. God be with you.